I'm not begging. I'll work for food, sir. 13-year-old Ethan whispered these words, his voice raw, his hope fragile. Most people didn't even notice him. Most just walked by, but then one man stopped. He didn't glance at the cardboard sign. He didn't hurry past. He looked straight into Ethan's eyes, and in that instant, everything changed. Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Little did Ethan know, the man who stopped wasn't a stranger at all. Under the pale brightness of an early spring morning, the city was already alive. New York moved like a restless tide. Taxi horns pierced the air, office workers hustled past with coffee cups and briefcases, and the sidewalks overflowed with hurried footsteps. The season was neither gentle nor forgiving. The wind carried a lingering chill, but the sun pressed down harshly, exposing every flaw, every shadow, and every face that tried to hide. Amid this current of rushing humanity stood a boy who did not belong to it. 13-year-old Ethan Miller was rooted to one patch of pavement, as if the weight of his life pinned him there. His sneakers were scuffed, his jeans too thin for the cold by the spring, and his jacket bore stains from too many nights slept on unforgiving benches. In his trembling hands, he held a piece of cardboard, creased, smudged, but carefully lettered with uneven strokes of a black marker. I'm not begging. I'll work for food, sir. He whispered those words too, almost under his breath, his voice rough from overuse. I'm not begging. I'll work for food, sir. To the backs of people walking away, to shoes that never paused, to shoulders that didn't turn. Each repetition came with a little less strength, but also a little more stubbornness, as if saying it often enough might eventually make someone hear. Most didn't even glance at him. Some frowned, tightening their grip on their bags as if he were a threat. Others simply pretended he wasn't there. To them, he was just part of the city's noise, a background figure in the endless story of strangers. But to Ethan, this was survival. His stomach ached with hunger that had long since stopped being sharp and instead settled into something dull, heavy, and constant. He hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, half a granola bar given by a woman who never slowed her pace. The city was merciless, but Ethan refused to collapse. He had promised himself he wouldn't beg. Work, yes. Earn it, yes. But not beg. Those 7 words on the cardboard were his shield against shame. His small claim to dignity in a world that seemed to have forgotten boys like him. Still, there were moments, fleeting ones, when fear tried to break through his resolve. What if no one stopped today? What if he went another night without food? What if the world really didn't care whether he disappeared? He shoved those thoughts away, clinging harder to the cardboard, to the words that gave him something to hold on to. The crowd kept flowing past. He was a rock in a rushing river, unmoving, overlooked, yet still standing. Ethan straightened his back, tried to look taller than his 13 years, tried to look like someone who deserved a chance. His eyes scanned the faces, searching desperately for one pair of eyes willing to meet his own. And then it happened. Through the blur of motion, a figure slowed. An older man, dressed neatly but not rushing like the others, paused a few feet away. His shoes were polished, his coat well cut, but what struck Ethan wasn't the clothes. It was the way the man looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him. The stranger's gaze didn't carry suspicion or pity. It carried something else. Curiosity, perhaps, and a quiet respect. He stepped closer, his voice rising gently above the rumble of traffic. "Young man," he said, his tone calm, steady, almost deliberate. "Do you mean that?" For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. This was it, the moment he had been whispering toward all morning. He swallowed, forcing his voice not to crack, forcing himself to stand straighter, braver than he felt. He lifted his chin, looked the man in the eye, and spoke with all the courage he could gather. "I'm not begging, sir. I'll work for food." 7 words, simple but sharp. They cut through the indifference of the crowd, and for the first time all day, they were heard, truly heard. And with that, something shifted. A moment that would change the course of 2 lives had quietly begun, right there on a crowded sidewalk under the harsh spring sun. Robert Miller did not often walk this part of the city. His world was usually measured in private car rides, conference rooms, and offices high above the streets. Yet on that particular morning, he had chosen to walk, a rare decision, born from something even he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was restlessness. Perhaps it was the stubborn ache of memories he thought he'd left behind. Or perhaps, in ways he would only later understand, it was fate guiding his steps. He walked with a kind of presence that drew notice without demanding it. His coat was pressed, his stride deliberate, his silver watch catching the sun when his sleeves shifted. The city was loud around him, but Robert carried a kind of quiet with him. An aura of stillness that seemed at odds with the rush of bodies all around. And then he saw him, the boy. At first, Robert almost passed by. He had grown accustomed, like so many others, to the city's endless chorus of need. Cardboard signs, tired faces, hands outstretched. But there was something in this boy's posture that arrested him. Not the clothes, not the dirt smudged across the boy's cheek, not even the smallness of his frame against the overwhelming tide of pedestrians. No, it was a defiance. The way the boy stood tall despite his shaking knees. The way he held that cardboard as if it were more than a sign. It was a declaration. I'm not begging. I'll work for food, sir. The words hit Robert harder than he expected. He slowed, stopped. For a moment, the two stood in a strange bubble of stillness while the city surged around them. Robert's gaze held the boy's. He noticed the thinness of his wrists, the hollowness beneath his eyes, but also the fire, small but steady, burning in the boy's stare. It was a look he recognized, though he could not place from where. Young man, Robert said, his voice steady, measured, but not unkind. Do you mean that? The boy's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his lips tightening in a way that betrayed nerves, but his answer was firm. I'm not begging, sir. I'll work for food. There was no tremor in the final words, only resolve. Robert let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The city around them went on, horns blaring, footsteps clattering, but in that moment, Robert's world narrowed to this boy and his 7 words. He saw not a beggar, not another casualty of the streets, but a child clinging to dignity like it was the last thing left to him. And dignity, Robert understood. Come with me, Robert said finally. He didn't raise his voice, didn't announce it as an offer or a command. It was simply spoken, and somehow it carried weight. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The man hadn't dropped a coin into his hand. He hadn't offered $1 or brushed past with sympathy. He had said, come with me. Ethan's chest tightened with hesitation. The world had taught him not to trust easily, not to follow strangers, no matter how kind their eyes seemed. But hunger gnawed at him, and something in the man's tone carried an assurance that didn't feel like danger. It felt like promise. Still, Ethan's voice was small when he whispered, to where? Robert studied him for a moment. The boy's fear was visible, and Robert didn't fault him for it. He adjusted his sleeve, his movements calm, deliberate. To eat, he answered simply. And if you truly mean what you've written, perhaps to work. The word struck Ethan like sunlight breaking through a heavy cloud. A real chance. Not just a sandwich, not just loose change tossed into a cup, but a chance to prove himself, to earn. The hesitation remained, but wore now with something stronger. Hope. Robert extended a hand, not to take Ethan's, but simply as a gesture of invitation. The boy stared at it, his fingers clutching his cardboard sign tighter, before slowly nodding. He took a step, then another, until at last he walked beside the man. The crowd parted around them, indifferent as ever. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have seen something remarkable. A wealthy man in a tailored coat and a hungry boy in worn-out sneakers, beginning to walk in the same direction. Neither of them knew it yet, but this unlikely crossing of paths would unravel secrets, stir old wounds, and open doors that had long been locked. And it all began because Robert Miller, the man who never stopped for anyone, had stopped for Ethan. The cafe was alive with the hum of the late morning crowd. Porcelain cups clinked softly against saucers. Steam hissed from the espresso machine, and voices overlapped in casual conversation. For most of the patrons, it was just another ordinary day. A break between errands, a meeting spot, a place to sip warmth against the cool edge of early spring. But when Robert Miller opened the door, Guiding a boy at his side, the rhythm of the room shifted. Not everyone noticed. Some barely looked up from their laptops or their papers. Yet those who did catch sight of the pair exchanged brief glances, quick, polite, and uncertain. The man was unmistakable. Polished, composed, a figure who belonged in high-ceiling boardrooms and black-tie dinners, not in the corner of a street cafe with a child who looked as though he had slept on sidewalks. The contrast between them was too sharp to ignore. Robert, however, seemed unbothered. He moved forward as though the weight of those glances meant nothing, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, not controlling, just steady. Ethan walked half a step behind, shrinking under the eyes that flicked toward him. His clothes were rumpled, his sneakers frayed, his face still carrying the trace of the street's grime. He clutched his cardboard sign tightly, as though it were a shield against judgment. A part of him wanted to turn and bolt out the door, to return to the anonymity of the sidewalk where no one looked too long because everyone was too busy. But another part, the louder part, kept him moving forward, drawn by the scent of coffee and fresh bread and the possibility of a meal. Robert led him to a table near the window, a place where light spilled in and painted the surface in warm gold. He pulled out a chair. Ethan hesitated, then sat, his small frame disappearing into its depth. A waitress approached, her notepad ready, her smile polite but guarded. She looked at Robert first, then at Ethan, her brows softening just slightly as she took in the boy's thinness. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get for you?" Robert's answer came without hesitation. Something warm, and enough to fill him. The waitress blinked, then nodded quickly, jotting down notes. "Of course, sir. Pancakes? Eggs? Hot chocolate?" At the mention of hot chocolate, Ethan's head lifted. His eyes, wide and hesitant, flickered with something bright. Robert caught it and allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch his lips. "Yes," he said, his gaze still on the boy. "Hot chocolate with extra cream." The waitress disappeared, leaving the two of them in a bubble of silence. Ethan's stomach growled, loud enough that he flushed and ducked his head. Robert noticed but said nothing, only reached into his pocket for a neatly folded handkerchief and slid it across the table. Ethan looked at it, confused, until Robert nodded gently. The boy wiped his hands, then his mouth, with a mix of gratitude and awkwardness. "You don't need to hide that you're hungry," Robert said quietly. His voice was not scolding, not pitying. It carried a steadiness that felt almost like permission. "Eat as much as you like. No one here will stop you." Ethan glanced around, uneasy. He still felt the weight of the room, the way conversations dipped when it entered, the way a few eyes lingered. But Robert's calm anchored him, and slowly, his grip on the cardboard sign loosened. The food arrived in waves. A plate of golden pancakes stacked high, butter melting into the ridges. A dish of scrambled eggs, fluffy and steaming. Toast, still warm. And, finally, the cup of hot chocolate, crowned with a mountain of whipped cream that seemed almost too perfect to touch. Ethan stared, frozen. For so long, meals had been scraps, hurried and uncertain, whatever you find, whatever someone would give. Now, here was abundance laid out before him. His throat tightened. "Go on," Robert urged softly. "It won't wait forever." Ethan reached first for the hot chocolate. His hand shook slightly as he lifted the cup, the warmth seeping into his palms, grounding him. He took one sip, just one, and the sweetness rushed through him like sunlight breaking cold shadows. His eyes closed, a small sound escaping his throat, something between relief and disbelief. Robert watched. He did not rush him, did not interrupt. He let the boy savor it, as though this moment, the simple act of drinking hot chocolate, was something sacred. Then came the pancakes. Ethan ate quickly at first, almost frantically, as though someone might snatch the plate away at any moment. But after Robert placed a gentle hand on the edge of the table and said, slowly, the boy forced himself to pause. He took smaller bites, chewed longer, tried to believe that the food wasn't going anywhere. By the time the plates had been cleared, Ethan leaned back in his chair, full in a way he hadn't been in weeks, maybe months. His shoulders slumped, the tension in his frame loosening for first time. Robert sipped his coffee, studying the boy over the rim of his cup. "What's your name?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, then answered softly. Ethan. The man nodded once, as though committing it to memory. Well, Ethan, he said, setting his cup down with deliberate care, you've worked hard enough just surviving. Let's see if we can find you something better than that. Ethan's eyes flicked up, wary but curious. And in that moment, sitting in a sunlit cafe with a full stomach and a stranger who had stopped when no one else would, the first thread of trust began to weave itself. Fragile, tentative, but real. The cafe had emptied little by little as the morning stretched into midday. Chairs scraped back, conversations faded, and soon the hum of the room quieted to a softer rhythm. Robert remained seated, unhurried, while Ethan lingered across from him, still clutching the empty cup of hot chocolate, like it was something too precious to let go. For the boy, the warmth in his stomach felt strange, almost foreign. Fullness was not a feeling he was used to. He kept waiting for the ache of hunger to return, for the hollowness to gnaw at him again. But for now, there was only comfort and the faint fear that it wouldn't last. Robert set his coffee aside, folded his hands, and studied Ethan quietly. He was careful not to make his gaze too sharp, too heavy. The boy had already lived too long under the weight of other people's eyes. You're not from here, are you? Robert asked gently. Ethan hesitated, shrinking into the chair. His instinct was to guard, to say nothing. Yet there was something about Robert's tone, neither demanding nor prying, that nudged an answer out of him. No, not really. Robert gave a slow nod. I thought so. He didn't press further. Instead, he leaned back, allowing silence to rest between them. He knew silence could be a kind of kindness, too. Ethan's fingers drummed lightly against a cardboard sign still propped in his lap. The words scrawled across it, I'm not begging. I'll work for food, sir. Were both shield and confession. Robert read them again, more carefully this time, and something in him stirred. A child had written those words. A child had carried them through the streets. He drew a measured breath, then spoke. Ethan, do you have somewhere to go tonight? The question hit harder than Ethan expected. His throat tightened. He looked down, his voice nearly lost. I'll figure something out. Robert's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened, the faintest crack in his otherwise composed exterior. Figuring it out, he said quietly, is not the same as being safe. The boy flinched because the truth of it landed too close. He didn't answer. Robert waited a moment longer before leaning forward, his tone steady but not imposing. I won't force you, but I have space. More than enough. You could come with me tonight. Have a bed, a roof, no strings attached. Ethan's eyes snapped up, startled. Offers like that didn't come from men in polished suits. Offers like that came with conditions, with traps. His first thought was disbelief. His second was suspicion. Why? The word slipped out before he could stop it. Robert's mouth curved slightly, though not into a full smile. It was more like an acknowledgement, because no child should be out there alone, and because I can. Ethan's grip on the cardboard sign tightened. His thoughts raced. Don't trust him. People lie. People hurt. People leave. The warnings etched into his memory screamed louder than his hunger ever had. But then, another voice, quieter, almost forgotten, whispered, what if this time is different? Still, hesitation weighed heavy. You don't even know me, Ethan said softly. Robert shook his head. Not yet. He paused. But I'd like to. The boy sat frozen, torn between fear and longing. Part of him wanted to say no, to run, to vanish back into the alleys where no one could touch him. But another part, the part that had tasted warmth in a cup of hot chocolate and fullness from a plate of pancakes, ached to believe the offer was real. Robert, sensing the storm inside him, didn't push. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card. With a pen, he wrote his address in neat, deliberate script. He slid it across the table. If you decide you'd rather not trust me today, that's fine. But if the night feels too long, too cold, you'll know where to find me. Ethan stared at the card, its clean white surface almost blinding compared to the worn cardboard he clutched. One piece of paper begged for survival. The other promised safety. The contrast made his chest ache. For a long moment, He said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet Robert almost missed it, he whispered, "Okay." Robert's posture eased just slightly. He stood, adjusting his coat, then held out his hand, not commanding, just offering. Ethan looked at it, uncertain. His own hand twitched, as though unsure whether to reach out or retreat. Finally, with visible effort, he lifted it and placed it in Robert's. His fingers were small, calloused, and trembling. Robert closed his own around them with quiet steadiness. "Come on then," he said softly. "Let's get you home." And just like that, hesitant, fragile, but real, the boy took his first step out of the streets and towards something he had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of belonging. The walk from the cafe to Robert's house was quiet. Ethan trailed a half step behind, his small shoes scuffing against the pavement. He clutched his cardboard sign tightly against his chest, as if it were both shield and anchor. Every sound, a passing car, a barking dog, the shuffle of footsteps on the opposite sidewalk, made him flinch. Robert kept his pace steady, never too fast, never too slow. He glanced back from time to time, but didn't crowd the boy with questions. Some silences, he knew, were safer than words. When they turned onto a quieter street lined with tall trees and ivy-covered fences, Ethan's eyes widened. The houses here were nothing like the crumbling buildings or damp alleys he was used to. These places looked untouchable. Windows gleamed. Gardens were trimmed. Doors stood tall and proud, painted in colors that didn't peel. And then Robert stopped. Before them rose a townhouse of warm brick and arched windows. Its doorway, framed with carved stone, held a brass knocker polished to a glow. The home stood with a kind of timeless dignity, not showy, but undeniably grand. Ethan froze at the gate. His stomach knotted. This wasn't just a house. It was another world, a world that didn't belong to him. He gripped the fence rail, his knuckles white. I shouldn't be here. Robert turned, his expression calm but firm. "You're here because I asked you to be. You're not trespassing, Ethan. You're welcome." The boy's throat tightened. The word welcome felt foreign, almost suspicious. He shifted from foot to foot, torn between bolting and stepping forward. Sensing the weight of his fear, Robert didn't usher him inside immediately. Instead, he reached for the iron gate and pushed it open with a quiet creak. "Just a door," he said gently. "Nothing more. And beyond it, a meal, warmth, and a bed. That's all. Nothing to be afraid of." Ethan stared at the path leading up to the house. The cobblestones gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, bordered by a garden of roses and ivy. He imagined muddy footprints staining them. Imagined the way the polished door might close on him if he wasn't careful. But then his stomach growled. Loud. Embarrassing. His face flushed hot. Robert pretended not to notice, only resting a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't demanding. It was simply steady. "Shall we?" Slowly, hesitantly, Ethan nodded. One small step, then another. The cardboard sign trembled in his arms as though it, too, was uncertain. When they reached the doorway, Robert took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door with an ease born of routine. The hinges gave a low groan as the heavy door swung open. Warm air drifted out, a mixture with polish, old books, and the faintest trace of lavender. It wrapped around Ethan instantly, different from the cold, biting air of the streets. He blinked, startled, as if the house itself was breathing him in. Robert stepped aside. "Go on," he said softly. The boy hovered at the threshold, his heart pounding. He thought of his mother, her voice telling him never to trust too easily, warning him that the world was unkind. He thought of the alleys where he had slept, the corners where shadows felt safer than people. And then he thought of the warmth of hot chocolate, of pancakes that filled him, of this man who hadn't asked for anything in return. His chest ached, his feet burned with indecision. And then, with a shaky breath, Ethan stepped across the threshold. Inside, the world changed. The floor beneath him gleamed with polished wood. A chandelier cast soft golden light that danced across walls lined with shelves of books and framed photographs. A staircase curved upward, its railing smooth and dark with age. Ethan's eyes darted everywhere, wide with disbelief. This is your house? Robert gave a quiet laugh, setting his coat on a stand near the door. Yes, too big for just one person, really. He glanced at the boy, whose shoes had already left small patches of dirt on the entryway floor. Robert noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he said, "It feels less empty already." Ethan lowered his gaze quickly, ashamed of the mud, ashamed of himself. He whispered, "I don't belong here." Robert crouched down, so his eyes were level with the boy's. His voice was firm but kind. "Ethan, belonging isn't about houses or shoes or polished floors. It's about people. And you're here now. That's what matters." The words sank deep, stirring something the boy had almost forgotten. Hope. But still, his voice trembled when he asked, "You won't change your mind?" Robert's gaze didn't waver. "No, not tonight, not tomorrow." A long silence hung between them. Then Ethan, clutching his cardboard sign tighter, gave the smallest nod. Robert straightened and motioned toward the living room, where soft couches and shelves of books seemed to invite rather than intimidate. "Come," he said, "let me show you where you can rest." For the first time in years, Ethan's next step didn't lead him into the cold or the unknown. It led him deeper into warmth, into shelter, into the beginning of something that might just change everything. The living room was both grand and strangely gentle. Tall shelves pressed with books reached toward the ceiling. Curtains of heavy fabric softened the evening light spilling through wide windows. A fireplace, cold for now, though lined with neat logs, waited to be lit. Ethan stood at the threshold of this new world, his thin shoulders hunched, his eyes darting from rug to furniture as though afraid he might break something simply by looking at it too long. The cardboard sign was still clutched to his chest, smudged from the grip of small, nervous hands. Robert motioned toward the couch. "Sit," he said. His tone was neither commanding nor casual. It was patient, as though he were speaking to someone fragile. Ethan lowered himself onto the very edge of the cushion. The softness startled him. He stiffened, as though the couch might swallow him whole. His toes curled against the floor, ready to run at the first sign that he didn't belong. Robert crossed to a cabinet in the corner and returned with a glass of water. He set it carefully on the low table. "Drink," he said. "You need it." Ethan hesitated, staring at the condensation running down the glass. He was thirsty, painfully so, but part of him feared it was a trick, something that would bind him to this house. Slowly, carefully, he lifted it with both hands. The water was cold, almost sharp against his throat. He drank until the glass was half empty, then set it down, embarrassed by how desperate he must have looked. Robert sat in the armchair across from him, studying the boy in silence. He noticed the way Ethan's ribs pressed faintly against his shirt, the dirt etched into the creases of his small hands, the wary flicker of his eyes. This child had lived more years on the streets than his age should have allowed. And then Robert asked the question, quietly, almost too gently, "What happened to your mother, Ethan?" The boy froze. His chest stopped, rising for a breath, as if the very air had been stolen from him. His eyes darted to the floor, to the sign, to the door, anywhere but Robert's steady gaze. His hands trembled against the cardboard until it bent under the pressure. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, a bird trilled once and fell silent again. Robert didn't push. He leaned back slightly, his posture open, his voice calm. "You don't have to tell me right away, but I want you to know it's safe here. No one will take your words and use them against you." Ethan's throat worked. He wanted to run, to disappear back into the alleys where questions didn't follow him, where silence was his only shield. But the gentleness in Robert's tone pressed against his defenses. Finally, in a voice no louder than a whisper, he said, She got sick." The word seemed to scrape his throat raw. His eyes glistened, but he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Sick?" Ethan nodded. "She coughed a lot. Couldn't breathe some days. She said it was nothing, just tiredness, but..." His voice broke. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eye, furious with himself for showing weakness. "She never got better." Robert's chest ached at the sight. He asked nothing more, only let the silence sit, soft and steady, so the boy could breathe through it. After a long pause, Ethan spoke again, halting, stumbling. One morning, she couldn't get up. She just didn't wake the same way. And then he swallowed hard. Then she was gone. The final word dropped heavy into the air. Ethan's small shoulders shook. He tried to hold himself still, tried to be stronger than his years, but grief poured through the cracks. Robert's hands tightened on the arm of his chair. He wanted to reach across, to draw the child into his arms, but he held himself steady. Trust was not built in a single gesture. It was built in patience. When Ethan's trembling eased slightly, Robert said, "You've carried this alone, haven't you?" The boy gave a tiny nod. His eyes burned with both defiance and despair. "No one wanted me. No family. No one." His voice was bitter, too old for his small frame. Robert exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then, carefully, he spoke the words that might shift the ground beneath them both. "You're not alone anymore." Ethan's head snapped up, eyes wide, searching Robert's face for mockery. But there was none, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. The boy didn't reply. He simply stared, his throat tight, his mind caught between disbelief and desperate wanting. For the first time in years, hope pressed against his ribs, fragile and terrifying. And in that moment, something shifted, unseen but undeniable. A door had opened wider than the one Ethan had stepped through earlier. Not the door to a house, but the door to something far greater. Robert rose from his chair, his movements unhurried. Ethan followed, uncertain, his small steps echoing faintly in the wide hallway. They stopped before a closed door at the end. Robert's hand rested on the handle for a moment, as if steadying himself. Then he pushed it open. The room beyond was gentle, almost untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, sunlight spilling across a quilt that looked carefully chosen. A bookshelf leaned against the wall, holding a handful of worn stories. A vase, empty now, stood on the desk as though waiting for flowers that never came. Ethan lingered in the doorway, his breath caught. He didn't need to ask, he knew. "This was hers," Robert said quietly. "Your mother's room. It's been waiting." The boy's eyes widened. For the first time, he stepped into a space that felt safe, familiar, like a whisper of the warmth he thought he'd lost forever. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing his fingers against the quilt. And for a fleeting second, the weight of the street slipped from his shoulders. That night, the house was quieter than the city ever was. No honking horns, no footsteps rushing past. Just the soft ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere down the hall. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight spilling through the curtains. It felt unreal, this softness, this warmth, this room that seemed to know his mother better than he ever could. But with that warmth came doubt, a question he couldn't silence. Was this real? Or was it another trick life was playing on him? Downstairs, Robert was pacing. His heart was steady, but his mind raced with memories. Grace as a child, Grace as a young woman, the sound of her laugh. And now, this boy who bore her eyes, her stubborn chin. He wanted to believe. Oh, how he wanted to believe. But belief needed proof. The next morning, Robert entered Ethan's room with something in his hand. A small envelope, its paper yellowed, edges frayed with time. He sat across from the boy, his expression unreadable. "This," Robert said softly, holding it out, "was a letter your mother once tried to send me. She never posted it. It was found in her things after she left. I kept it because I couldn't let go." Ethan's eyes widened. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was his mother's, Grace. His mother's loops and slants. Tears threatened his eyes before he even broke the seal. Inside was a short note, written years ago. Her words pressed onto paper with quiet desperation. "Dad, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but if I have a son someday, I want you to know him. I want him to know you." The boy's throat tightened. His lips quivered, but no sound came. The note felt like a bridge across time, a voice from the past speaking directly to this moment. Robert leaned closer. His voice was low, trembling. "Ethan, I need to know. Tell me something only Grace would have told you. A story, a memory, anything. The boy closed his eyes. He searched through the fog of his short life, through the scraps of moments with his mother. Finally, he whispered. She used to hum when she cooked. Not a song, just a tune, soft, like she was talking to food. She said her mother did it too, said it made the meals taste like home. Robert's hand shook. He covered his face, and for the first time in years, the tears came freely. That was Grace. That was her. The old man reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand. You are her son, my grandson. There's no doubt left. The boy's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his tears finally spilling. For the first time, the word family didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of truth, full of the beginning of something neither of them thought they'd ever have again. The morning light seeped through the curtains, soft and golden, spilling across the polished floor. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the small envelope his grandfather had given him the night before. The letter was still open, still pressed against his chest like a talisman. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the gnawing hunger in his stomach. He didn't feel the cold of the streets pressing against his back. He felt safe. Downstairs, Robert moved quietly through the house, arranging a few things for breakfast. The clink of cutlery and the hiss of the coffee machine felt ordinary, yet extraordinary. Every sound was a reminder that life could be calm, warm, and welcoming. Ethan descended the stairs slowly, barefoot on the polished floor. Each step was careful, cautious, as though he were testing if this reality would hold, if it could truly be his. Robert glanced up from the kitchen counter and smiled. Good morning, he said softly. Sleep well. Ethan nodded, still gripping the letter. His voice was small but steady. Yes, I can't believe this is real. Robert chuckled quietly. It's very real. He placed a plate in front of Ethan, golden toast, scrambled eggs, and fruit. Not a feast, not a show of wealth, just a simple meal prepared with care. The boy sat down, eyes wide, and began to eat. Not hurriedly, not with fear, but slowly, deliberately, tasting the warmth of a life that had been denied him for too long. Once breakfast was done, Robert led Ethan to the study. There are some things we need to do, he said gently. Legal things, social services, paperwork to make sure you're officially my grandson, so no one can take you from this home. Ethan's eyes flicked up uncertain. I thought I didn't have anyone to do that for me. You do now, Robert said firmly yet softly. I'm here, and we'll do it together. For the next hour, Robert guided Ethan through simple steps, signing forms, confirming details, explaining how things would work. The boy listened carefully, absorbing each word. He didn't fully understand the legalities, but he understood the meaning. He belonged somewhere officially. Later, Robert led him back to the preserved bedroom, now with small touches added. A few of Ethan's own items, a clean set of clothes neatly folded, a small journal on the desk. The room was no longer just a memory of his mother. It had begun to transform into a space that could hold him too. Ethan ran his fingers across the quilt, now imagining mornings waking here, afternoons reading on the window seat, nights filled with safety instead of fear. The past would always be a shadow, but this was light. Robert watched in the doorway, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This is your home now, he said. Welcome to your life, Ethan. The boy turned, eyes glistening, and smiled, hesitant, fragile, but real. Thank you, he whispered. No words could capture the depth of that moment. The streets, the cardboard sign, the desperate pleas, they were behind him now. Ahead was a life of belonging, a life of love, and the start of countless mornings bathed in sunlight instead of fear. Ethan picked up the letter once more, pressed it to his heart, and looked out the window at the city below. The world still moved fast, still demanded, still tested. But he no longer had to face it alone, because now he had a family, because now he had hope. And in the quiet, golden light of that morning, a new chapter began. Ethan's life had changed in ways he never imagined. From a boy standing alone with a cardboard sign, to a boy with a home, a family, and hope. The streets that once felt endless and unforgiving were now a memory, replaced by a life filled with warmth, care, and the kind of love he had only dreamed of. Sometimes one small moment, one brave choice can change everything. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV. Share your thoughts, share your feelings, and be part of a community that believes in the power of hope, kindness, and second chances. And remember, every story has the power to change a life, maybe even yours.